Well, well. So, Chris's ongoing redemption arc. This is an arc that has started off with a little. It would be understood why so many people go into this with a healthy dose of skepticism. Because how many times have we heard it before from Chris, who claims to apologize, to say sorry, to say that he has changed, when the only thing that does seem to change is that Chris gets a little bit older, and every single time he does this, he looks just that little bit more confused as to why he's doing it. There seems to be a little bit of a lack of connection as to the words he is saying and whether or not he understands why he's doing it. Now, that's always been such a huge gripe with people when it comes to whether or not it's possible to feel sorry for Chris, especially and in particular when moments when Chris does say sorry. Or rather, not so much when Chris says sorry, but when Chris claims to apologize. The theory goes that usually, and well, to be honest, we can best scale this back to how, and it's important to remember quite a lot of this, as to how and why this so-called redemption arc, how, when, where, why, what, and how this all came into being. It started because Chris got kicked out of something called HarmonyCon, which I believe is meant to be some sort of My Little Pony themed convention, and Chris went in there disguised as the White Tiger Ranger from the original Power Rangers series. Now, you may be asking yourself why Chris thought it was a good idea to go to a convention, since it had come to be accepted that following his arrest in 2021, Chris probably should have accepted it as fact that he was pretty much blacklisted from every single convention in the United States. Not just because of Chris's online reputation, not just because of Chris's past actions at certain conventions, aka Too Many Games, circa 2017. Was it 2017 or was it 2018 where Chris got kicked out? At some point, the memories still remain fresh in a lot of people's minds. But the interesting detail is this. Chris started crashing out as a result of HarmonyCon, in which what kickstarted the redemption arc, as he calls it, in which he calls himself a pervert, says that there's a lot of bad things he's done, a lot of things that he said have come across as racist, and basically he went through sort of a itinerary of things that he had admitted to doing wrong. The problem is that it doesn't cover every single thing he's done wrong, but it covers quite a lot of them. Pseudo major ones, pseudo less serious. Now, I know what you're probably thinking to yourselves. You can sort of place yourself in one of two camps when it comes to stuff like this, and I must admit, I was very much in this myself. You can either forgive Chris, and you know what, say, you know what? At least Chris actually has the bottle to apologize. Not many other people would do the same thing. I suppose there's something to be said in Chris actually having the bottle to apologize. Even if you are fortunate enough not to understand everything else that Chris has done, so especially when it comes to attitudes about apologizing. But so that one about forgiving is a little bit skeptical. I understand the sort of people who would, and they're doing it because, you know what, they think it's morally the right thing to do, in lieu of everything else. Then there are the people who do not forgive Chris, because they know as well as I do that every single time Chris has claimed to apologize, Chris will not stand by his apology, and as they say, forever is cursed to sin once again. Sometimes Chris will double down on this so-called forgiving and start pointing fingers at other people, claiming to be Jesus Christ. Oh wait, that's right, Chris already thinks he is. Yeah, it's a little bit of a tough one, I must admit. Considering that for someone calling themselves Jesus Christ, the last time I think Chris ever went to church was about 8 years ago, something like that. I'm not really saying it like it's one way or the other. I'm just saying is that it's always kind of staggered me a little bit about how Chris claims to have read the Bible, and he claims to know very, very little about its significance, or rather what it set out to prove, or even any of the parables set out to prove or to teach people. Mind you, I suppose maybe a lack of cognitive learning, I suppose, maybe is the next problem with all of this. How much does Chris actually learn from his mistakes? Well, based on the aforementioned criteria, one would immediately say Chris... In fact, to be honest, Chris hasn't learned a single thing. In fact, the only thing Chris has learned is that if he gets into trouble for something that has very real-world implications, therefore he must be doing something wrong. Because a lot of this also boils down to something that is not what you call unfounded or lost on Chris, and that is, well, as they say, he doesn't like to be told things that he doesn't want to hear. Very, very common in amongst quite a lot of adults. However, if Chris expects to be taken seriously or to be forgiven, it would be taken almost for granted that it should be come to expected that when you say sorry, you have to acknowledge what you did was wrong. And quite a lot of the things that Chris did his initial redemption arc apology for, these were things that were going back nearly 20 years ago. And Chris, are you really trying to tell us you're saying you were it suggests the idea that and he literally starts it up by saying we are all perverts, which is also a fantastically backwards way to start an apology, by saying that we are all in this. So therefore, you have to be the one to apologize, when Chris is out there begging for forgiveness in what he calls his own redemption arc. Yeah, if I'm being honest, this whole redemption arc is already off on a bad foot, and I've went to explain this in more detail in a separate video, but the thing you need to understand just before I finish is this redemption arc is quite frankly not going well, because so far the only thing Chris has technically done to begin all this is say that he acknowledges the things he's done wrong. This, however, opens up a monumental can of worms, because ever since his discovery on the internet 19 years ago, and through Chris's own admission, this would imply that he knew perfectly well what he was doing was wrong, up to and even including the affair with his own mother. I think you may say that's a little bit that might be a little bit of a stretch, in to say that Chris just subtly admitted to it. However, that again is also one of those things that sadly pretty much only one person knows, and that would be Chris himself. For example, I couldn't stand in a court of law and say, yes, Your Honor, I saw with my own two eyes what they were getting up to. How could I? I wasn't there, so obviously not. That's the thing also has confused me quite a lot in regards to the whole affair with his mother, is that why would Chris ever admit to something like that? Or even contemplate? Well, that's the thing as well. Because bear in mind, Chris has never once apologized for anything in regarding to his his own mother. Because one would imagine that if Chris did admit that was the thing he did something to his mom, that would be implication and basically an admission of guilt. Something that, to be honest, would mean that he would get sent straight back to prison. Some may argue that might be like an actual test of redemption somewhat, because Chris actually did, quote unquote, the right thing by finally telling the truth. But finally, to wrap this all up, some may say that's a bit too little, too late. A bit like this whole redemption arc, it would seem. Is it too little, or is it too late? Or is it both? But that's something that I feel like the days and weeks ahead will tell for themselves, because I'm not convinced. But what I am convinced, however, is that however this redemption arc goes, starts, stops, finishes, ends, Chris will be the one who does that. But is Chris even capable of even that level of thought, or even carrying that thought forward far enough to think that people care one way or the other? But with that being said, I hope all of you guys enjoyed this little discussion, if you will, and I'll see you guys again next time. Thank you.